strategy is a plan to achieve a long-term objective. And that objective, hopefully setting you apart from the competition, also such that you continue adapting and changing to changes in the environment, changes in technology, change in customer expectations. It requires, and I think this is where people miss, it requires a tremendous amount of focus. And it requires tough trade-offs. And if you're not making tough trade-offs, you probably have not really gotten to the essence of a differentiated strategy.
Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyle Krippendorff, founder of Outthinker Network, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists and innovators that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. You just heard from David Whorton, a tech investor and founder who spent 20 years of his career at the highest levels of Silicon Valley, venture capital, and tech startups. For example, at the preeminent tech venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins, he worked directly with John Doerr for several years. He co-founded 4 companies, including Drugstore.com and Good Technology. This episode is a little bit longer than usual, and for a good reason. It's about companies that last longer. We dive deep into the world of what he calls evergreen businesses, those built to adapt and grow profitably for 100 years or more. Think of these as the direct juxtaposition to venture capital-funded enterprises, where those are built with the sole intention of scaling quickly and selling or going public or shutting down if they're not performing. Evergreen businesses are built to endure. In 2013, Dave founded Tugboat Institute to connect, support, and inspire purpose-driven leaders of these types of businesses. His latest book with Bo Burlingham, Another Way, Building Companies That Last and Last and Last, was released in May 2025. In this episode, we uncover some of the most profound insights from his book, so many of which fly in the face of current common dogmas around innovation and business building, including why the companies that VCs most tout today as exemplars of technological greatness, think Google, think Microsoft, took very little VC funding, and why you should probably avoid VC investors as well. The fact that the size of the venture capital market has exploded multifold since 1999, and what that means for the nature of how businesses are built and operate today. The evergreen 7 Ps that characterize these companies, and specific case studies and examples of companies that live these values. 2 of my favorites are: they pace their growth, they avoid hyperscaling, they pursue pragmatic innovation rather than radical breakthrough innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Whorton. Thank you for being here. I am so fascinated by your work. So much to cover. We won't be able to cover all of it, but thank you for sitting down with us to share a little bit. So I'm going to open up with the same 2 questions I ask all my guests. First is just for us to get to know you a little bit personally. Could you complete the sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
I guess if you really know me, you know that I was steeped in Silicon Valley for quite some time. Went to Berkeley, went to Stanford Business School. I did several tech startups. I was involved in a very high-profile venture capital firm, Kleiner Perkins. But now live in Sun Valley, Idaho, which is, if you'd asked me in 2008, you're going to live with your family in Sun Valley, Idaho, I would have said, I'm not sure where that is on the map. But that's where our kids end up going to middle school and high school. That's where I built my business, Tugboat Institute, and I spend a tremendous amount of time hiking in the wilderness now, which I wouldn't have imagined back in the days when I lived in Menlo Park.
And what brought you originally there?
It was a Stanford Business School professor, Chuck Holloway, had said to me, I was looking for like a second home in a mountain town. He said, you really should look at Sun Valley. So August 2008, right before Lehman collapsed and all things started falling apart, my daughter and I, when she was 6 years old, came up and spent a weekend. And we just kind of fell in love with it. Just had a really interesting, comfortable vibe, very different than Silicon Valley. And then 6 months later, we made an offer on a house, and then my wife met the headmaster of a place called the Community School, which had a very unique approach to balancing academic rigor and outdoor adventures to really develop the kids' resilience. And so we decided to give it a year, and people said, that never works. A year will become permanent. And I said, nah, not in our case. I'm kind of a Bay Area guy, and there we go. The others were correct, and I was wrong.
Great to be open to being wrong. I am wrong often. And you started your career at HP. and you did some time at Apple and HP Labs. And how did that shape your thinking and experience?
Yeah, this was really an opportunistic thing where I needed to get a job because I was well aware I was going to have to put myself through college. I was one of the top kids in my class, and I wasn't real excited about spending a couple of years at community college, which would have been an option. We had a good one in Santa Rosa. I wrote a letter looking for a janitorial job or cafeteria, gardening. I'd never imagined they'd reach out and say, look, if you're interested in engineering, we have an established program. We bring people in and you get to work in manufacturing. You get matched up with an engineering mentor. You spend a lunch with the general manager of a division. I'm like, sign me up. And I did that for 4 summers. And it wasn't, I don't want to overstate it. I was doing manufacturing work. I was soldering back when you soldered print circuit boards. I was assembling chassis. One summer I spent under a microscope assembling gold parts, and it would go into network analyzers. But I got to know the employees well. I got the sense of what the HP way was about. And it really moved me. I really liked the way they treated people. And the assumption at that age is everybody treats people that way, correct? It's your first experience. But later I'd find, starting at my career at Bain & Company, which was after Berkeley, that no, there's many companies that don't view it this way at all. But it did make this indelible mark on me about this idea of really taking care of your employees.
Yeah. Great. Just a clarification question. Are you saying that your experience at Bain was very different, or your experiencing other companies while at Bain, you realized that other companies were different?
I love Bain. It was a San Francisco office. There was about 100 people. It was an incredible experience. It was the clients of Bain that were struggling with strategy, struggling to kind of create a competitive advantage. And often in those environments, I was really disappointed at how they generally talked about their employees and thought about them.
Yeah, no, and I can see that Bain influence, that HP influence as you kind of like came out of Kleiner Perkins and TPG and kind of where you landed. So a lot of experience in strategy. My second question for you is, what is your definition of strategy?
Yeah, that's great. So I think generally strategy is a plan to achieve a long-term objective. And that objective, hopefully setting you apart from the competition. Also, such that you continue adapting and changing to changes in the environment, changes in technology, change in customer expectations. It requires, and I think this is where people miss, it requires a tremendous amount of focus, and it requires tough trade-offs. And if you're not making tough trade-offs, you probably have not really gotten to the essence of a differentiated strategy. And I think that's where a lot of people fall short. And then also, it has to evolve as your resources change over time. Of course, as a very small startup, you've got a limited number of resources. Your strategy has to be influenced by the availability of those resources. But as you get to be large, as you said earlier, companies doing $1 billion in revenues has tremendous access to resources. And so it allows them to do things that the smaller firm couldn't do. So it's a dynamic thing too. Andy Grove was a professor at the Intel CEO at Stanford Business School when I was there. And he made this very clear. I mean, strategy is an adaptive process. You can't just set strategy and come back to it 5 years later. You constantly have to be looking to see if there's major inflection points, major changes, and adapt to those. And I think people struggle with this. I think it's a great question to ask because, within my membership of almost 300 CEOs, I've got one member I just love, and he just raises this over and goes, what really is strategy? And he's pushing this. He's read every strategy book he can. And he says, it's hard to really get people to clearly articulate what a effective strategy is and what it represents. And I think that's why this question you're asking is so important, because it really does have to be thought through very clearly. And it really does require focus and trade-offs and understanding of your resources, understanding how you ultimately can differentiate yourself. Now, in the terms of an evergreen company, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, you're thinking about a 100-year time horizon. That also impacts your strategy. If your owners have a very short-term orientation, there's only certain things you can do. For example, if you have to perform against a quarterly target versus a firm where the owners, let's say a small group of family members of a family-owned business, say, look, you can take 12 years to develop this product because if you do this successfully, you will change the world. And we have one of those in our membership that actually did a very important component of the stop-start batteries that sit in every single car today. And it took them over a decade to dial in that technology. And now without that technology, you couldn't have that type of battery.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I guess if strategy is something that changes over time, that you adapt, that makes sense. Because when I think of like Microsoft or Apple or Google or Amazon, these kind of big behemoths, they took a long time to get to. I think, Apple took 30 years before it really hit its scale point. And yet, in the VC world today, a lot of it's about blitz scaling and, getting early funding. And so just like unpack that for you. It's like how much VC capital did, these big Microsoft, Apple raise to get to where they are?
And do you mind if I just step back just a step further on context setting on this? So one of the things that people aren't really aware of is that if you look at the first 40 or so years of venture capital, up until, let's say, 1999, early 2000, the total amount of venture capital that was raised and deployed was actually $25 billion, a little less than $25 billion. In the last 8 years, the venture capital industry, every single year, raised over $250 billion.
What?
10x every single year for 10 years. So we're seeing something has changed so fundamentally that what is happening in venture capital pre and post the dot-com boom is like two completely different worlds, two completely different playbooks. At Kleiner Perkins, even in the days when we were working very close with Amazon and Google in its earliest days, I think Amazon had 50 employees and Google had less than 20. We talked about reasonable financings, like be careful, don't raise too much money. Constraints actually drive creativity. There was more money available out there. We didn't really think we needed it. You wouldn't even have those conversations today. I mean, if you're at the same stage of Google, you'd raise $400 million, not $25 million. And so that brings me to this thing that you're leading into, which is, do you know how much money Microsoft raised venture capital before it went public?
No guess.
$1 million.
What?
Wow.
Before it was until public.
Right. Because they were already profitable. And Bill Gates wanted to work with Dave Marquardt. Wanted him, and Dave said, the way I work with people is I have to be an investor. So he basically sold, I think, 10% of Microsoft for $1 million to get Dave Marquardt on the board. He didn't need the money. And then in the case of Google, it was $25 million, 12.5 from Kleiner Perkins, 12.5 from Sequoia, 25 million, not 25 billion. 25 billion is what Uber raised. 25 million is what we're talking about for Google. And then for Amazon, it was $9 million. And most of that provided by Kleiner Perkins, by John Doerr, again, in that case. $9 million. Now, they raised more money over time. They did $1 billion debt financing out of Europe in late 1999. So yes, they did raise capital, but venture capital, it was $9 million. So if you sum it up, it's $35 million was required by venture capitalists to build 3 companies worth over $2 trillion each.
And so what is the danger, or what's wrong with that? Like, we had John Mullins on this podcast. One of the books that he wrote is called The Customer Funded Business. And what he showed is that there's a negative correlation between how much you raise in Series A and what your success rate is. His rationale is when you take a lot of money, then you're locked into a business model, and then you have to execute that business model. You can't adapt. Is that one of the reasons, or what's your interpretation?
Yeah, my reaction might be a little more nuanced. The day you take $1 of venture capital, or from an angel that's a venture capital pathway, you have set your path. You will be sold or you'll be taken public. That's it. Or you're going to be shut down. There's only 3 options. You will never be an evergreen company. You will not survive 100 years as an independent private company. Your children will not run that business someday. Your employees will not own a part of that business someday. That path is already set and it's irreversible. And so that one is, that's a path you've set on, you cannot back off of. And then second, this tremendous amount of capital, I think we're still going to find out. I think look at Uber. Uber raised close to $30 billion. Was that a well-run business? Horribly run business. Now, they made a big bet. They were going to try to take the entire world. They basically destroyed mom and pop black car services throughout the entire country. And that's the story that's not told, because they underpriced them based on all this investor money. It could not, as a business model, sustain the pricing they did. Now they've raised the prices. They're quite expensive again. They'll probably, I think they're profitable in the last year or two. But how do you return $30 billion? Let's say it needs to be a 3x on that $30 billion. You got to have a $100 billion return. It's just hard to imagine it. Whereas, any of the 3 I talked about already, there were trillions of dollars, and they raised, the largest amount of money raised was really Google at $25 million. And they didn't need the $25 million, let's be clear. They didn't need it. That's just the amount of dilution. They were only comfortable taking about 25% dilution. John and Mike felt the same way, which is we'd like to own 15 to 20%. We'll go down to 12.5%. So it was basically kind of putting the pieces together. Say, okay, well, 25%, $25 million, that sounds fine. They didn't need it. They could probably taken 5 or 10 and been just fine. It's incredible. So yeah, there's something that's fundamentally different. And then I think it leads to overhiring. It leads to sloppy practices. Back to the definition of strategy, it requires no focus. The only focus you have to have is, can I raise my next round of financing? And if I can raise my next round of financing, I can continue what I'm doing. But you can have product proliferation, you can have distribution proliferation, you can overhire your sales force. You can get really sloppy. Whereas these firms,
You're actually motivated, right? Because you need to come up with a rationale for needing more funding.
right. And then here's something Clayton Christensen and I talked about before he passed away, is he said that, his view is for truly market-creating disruptive technologies, not efficiency innovations, which most are, but really creating a new market from whole cloth. He said the pattern is very much proven. I 100% agree, given what I've read, researched, and experienced myself, is that you take that emergent technology into a niche market.
Yeah.
You develop the capabilities of that technology over a period of years before you go into mainstream markets and compete, hopefully very successfully. VCs do not tolerate that time frame or the niche market. If you walked in and told a venture capitalist, I'm pursuing a $50 million market, eventually hope you get to a multi-billion-dollar market, they say, I can't back you. Come back to me when you decided you're ready for a big market. Because they have to have such large outcomes because their fund sizes are so large. And so it's changed the amount of capital that's coming to venture capital has actually changed the way venture capitalists build businesses, and I think to the worse. And the problem is the management fees are so valuable. I mean, if you have a $100 million fund, you might get $2 million a year in management fees. That's not a lot to pay the bills, rent Menlo Park, have a couple of people on your staff if you only have one fund. If you raise $1 billion fund, that's $20 million a year. And if you start stacking funds every 2 or 3 years, multi-billion-dollar funds, suddenly your management fees end up being hundreds of millions a year. Your base salary can be 4, 5, 6, 10, $15 million. You haven't returned a dollar to your investors. So the entire model shifted. And there's also a really unique dynamic around this, is that it's kind of the GP-LP conversation, which is the GP will say, look, and I know venture capitalists have said this to me. I won't say names. Like, they're giving me more money.
General partner, limited partner.
Yeah, general partner of a venture firm. They're giving us more money than I can really see how to earn a good return on, but they're smart people too. And so we're not going to refuse their capital. And so that's this thing. And then private equity's mirrored this. I mean, private equity has raised every year for the last 10 years. So again, this has slowed down in the last couple of years, but they're raising about $500 million a year for the last 10 years. I mean, half a trillion. And they match that with $1 trillion of debt. So they have $1.5 trillion of capacity to buy companies, roll up companies, and somehow they keep screwing them up. It's incredible. And the reason is this debt, in particular with rising interest rates, has to be paid down. You have to service those interest payments. The way you do is you do it largely on the back of future innovation and the employees.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's a tough business model.
Yeah, I think as I'm hearing what you're saying, I'm hearing several of your P's here, right? You mentioned stay private, be profitable early, use persistent, pragmatic innovation, find that beachhead and then innovate in that beachhead before you go into the open water. I'd love to, for the audience, kind of break this down, because you have, I think, 7 very eloquently described and sequenced keys. I'm just going to read them. Purpose, people first, private, profit, paced growth, pragmatic innovation, perseverance. Usually we don't go through all of them in a podcast, but I think each one clings on the other and is so important that I'd love to very briefly go through each one. And let's just start with purpose. Why does it have to start there? And how do you know that you have an effective purpose?
Yeah, it's really interesting is that, I think of the 7 P's working together as a system, and that's what you're basically saying. And so in system thinking, there are trade-offs within the system to optimize the overall system, correct? But purpose is not one of those. Purpose has to come first because that's your North Star. That is why your business even exists. That's why your employees are showing up. That's what's going to get them through the toughest of periods, right? Is knowing that what they're doing is so important to the world. The unfortunate thing, and I'll get into what authentic purpose is that if you're venture-backed, if you're private equity owned, if you're a public company, your purpose is already defined for you. It's defined for you. You don't get to set your purpose. You can put whatever you on your website about taking care of people, changing a market. The purpose of a venture-backed company.
Because your investors have their purpose, which is exit in 5 years.
That's exactly right. That is the dominant purpose, which is you have to get me a high valued exit in a reasonable period of time. And so ultimately we will force the team and strategy to comport to that. Now, maybe for a few years when we first back you, we'll let you do what you want to do. But at some point, as it starts becoming time that we need you to harvest, you will start doing a set of activities that we need you to do to get the maximum value, or you won't be running this firm anymore. There's no connection to purpose at all there, right? And so if the person said, my purpose is to restructure this industry based on this new technology, yeah, as long as that's aligned with getting the purpose of your investors to ultimately control the business. Private equity, the same thing. And then public, of course, the purpose is to maximize your shareholder value. And I think Milton Friedman spoke about this very eloquently back in the 1970s, which is too many CEOs of public companies back then were using the purse and treasury of the corporation for personal benefit. For private planes, private cafeterias, chefs, drivers, cars, charitable donations in their name on behalf of the corporation. He said, look, you can't do that because you're not really serving your distributed ownership base. You don't know what they really want. So the only thing you can really do is make sure you maximize profitability for them. So those purposes are all set. A private company owned by people with good values can set whatever purpose they want. They can set their North Star because they own the business. And if they want the business to be around for 300 years, they want it to have such X impact in a certain market, they want to treat people a certain way, they can do those things. And, the biggest foundation-owned companies out of Europe are an example of this, whether it be IKEA, right? Or it be Lego, or it be Rolex. Why are those companies so special? Well, because they're privately owned by a foundation. And we see the same thing in America with family-owned businesses, employee-owned businesses. Patagonia, good example. Meyer, Edward Jones, White Castle, Wegmans.
I didn't realize.
C. Tanner.
How that is. Wow.
Mars. And so the amazing thing is ownership actually matters, and we don't talk about it in business schools. We simply say, look, if you're going to build a company, go raise some capital. And it's like, no, that's not actually the right answer. The best answer, if the purpose you have in mind is building a sustaining company as an independent entity that serves a higher calling than just making your investors money, is not to raise that outside capital. It is to do, as you said, think about these 7 Ps. Set that purpose, be committed to persevering, keep low debt levels, make sure the team has a strong culture, an adaptive culture, treat your people really well because that's where all the magic happens ultimately over long periods of time. Stay private and protect that private, but also take advantage of all the governance structures you might see in the best run companies, but do them in a private context. Get profitable early, stay profitable, build a strong balance sheet over time, continue to pace your growth, because the thing that actually absorbs most cash in businesses is growing too fast. And that's what the hyper-growth model does. But if you're willing to grow 15% a year for the next 30 years, your company will be 66 times larger in 30 years. If you grow at 20%, it'll be 250 times larger. So growth rates, which venture capitalists, and including myself, admitted, I would have laughed at somebody saying, I'm going to grow this business at 20% a year forever. I'd be like, okay, well, I'm not writing a check for you. You're not going to give me the exit in the time frame I need. But if you can do 20% a year and you start at $10 million, you're a $2.6 billion revenue company 30 years later. That's in your lifetime. And you know examples of this, and I know examples of it. It's awesome. Look what Andy Taylor did. His dad started Enterprise Rental Car, got it to about $60 million in revenue. Andy started was in a leadership role before the $60 million, but he took it over at 60. He grew it to $25 billion over 30 years. No outside capital at all, zero. Warren Buffett would have bought his company any day of the week if he was given the opportunity. I think Warren showed up many times on the doorstep. They're actually friends. And then he just said, Warren, we're not selling the company. Yes.
But I see how these interconnect, right? Because if you have the purpose that gives you the long term, then when you're doing an NPV on 5 years with an exit, you need fast growth. If you're doing an NPV on 30 years, the right answer is that pace growth. The compounding, right?
The compounding. And then you don't need outside capital. You maintain control. The other subtle thing for a founder, which is really important, is, and I've experienced this personally with good technology, if you're growing at 50 to 100% a year, and that growth may be funded by outside capital versus revenues, right? But that's, those levels of you are always recruiting. You're always scrambling. You're always thinking about how you raise the next round of financing. There's very little time for you to develop yourself as a leader. At 20% a year, you have a lot of time to develop yourself as a leader, to develop your management team, to make mistakes, to figure out like, oh, I really am getting a sense for what a good exec looks like versus not such a good exec. You give yourself breathing room. VCs will not give you that breathing room. What they'll want to see is either you're figuring it out really fast, you're listening to our direct instruction on this, or a coach we put in place to help you, or you just have to admit it. You can't do this, and let's put an experienced CEO in here and get out of the way. We'll make a chairman.
So how do you coach? Because you coach these 300 evergreen companies, one of them even 300 years old. How do you coach someone to know if the pace of growth that we're pursuing is healthy? Because there's that poll, right? If I could get 30% to 15% this year, whatever my indicator.
I think of three things. I think of money, I think of management, and I think of culture. And if you're growing such that you're on a thin line as far as your cash, you're growing too fast, at least under the current design of your business model and how you manage your cash cycle. And I'd say pull some levers. Look at your cash cycle, look at your pricing strategy, try to generate more cash. And it may even cause you to switch business models to find whether it is actually more cash generative and less capital intensive. Second is your management team. Are they able to absorb the growth rate in which you're going? Not the existing leadership team and the next bench below them? Because if you're outstripping them, then things really start to break.
So either that you're replacing management or they are not yet ready.
And you will. I mean, the truth is you will replace management. Maybe not all of the 7 direct reports you have when you're doing 10 million in revenue, but you'll probably by 100, you'll have most of those replaced. And I learned this from John Mordridge at Cisco, and I thought it was very powerful. And celebrate the contributions of the original 7 for the rest of your life leading that company, because they made an incredibly important contribution. They handed the baton successfully to somebody who could handle the larger scale. I mean, it's all just part of growing up. I mean, it's not something you should be afraid of, right? And then the third is culture. Is the team starting to shake, or the behaviors no longer consistent with the norms that you had seen in the past? And that happens too. So you got to think about money, management, and culture. And if those are largely staying in balance and maybe a little tension here and there, then your growth rate is probably fine. Different firms have different views on this. Some are like, look, we've dialed this in. I know a particular very well-respected professional services firm says we think we can add about 8% to headcount every year, which leads to about 8% growth in revenue. Too fast, faster than that, it's too fast. Too slow, there's not enough opportunity for the team. We've had others that say, like, no, we actually grow because of our industry 25% a couple years in a row. Then we'll actually slow way down to like 5% to absorb the growth, fix our IT systems, retrain the new management teams. And so it's not this, none of them have kind of a smooth up into the right curve, for sure, the one that's idealized by the public markets. But there's different ways to kind of grow to kind of make sure you stay in this bounded range where you're not breaking things on a permanent basis.
Right. That makes sense. So, I mean, you're also leading a lot with people, this people first concept. I want to believe it. I believe my mission in life is people loving what they do. We had Stephen Meyer here from Columbia. He said, people are your new customer. I believe it, but convince me that people first is an important principle.
I'm so steeped in this now that it's almost hard to remember when I wasn't, to be honest with you. And I wasn't, very frankly, even though the seeds have been planted in me by Dave and Bill at Hewlett Packard, and their culture, got very much about, do we have a great business model? Can we raise enough capital? Do we have good product market fit and all that? That's all when you're thinking in things in short time horizons. If you're thinking of things in 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, it has to be about the people, because the firm's going to have to adapt, and it's going to have to change, and it's going to have to innovate, and it's going to have to grow into new territories, and there's new products and product lines over time. It's going to have to try new processes and systems and adopt new types of technology like AI today. That's all about people. And so if your people feel empowered, supported, well compensated, they're more creative. They're more willing to take risk. If it's an environment where it's like, hey, you make a mistake, boy, you can really pay for it, then people pull back. And if that happens, you're dead over long periods of time. You might get sold, you might get out, but the way you're going to be a strong, thriving company 100 years from now is because it will be that deep, meaningful purpose and very much tied to taking care of your people. And the people will then solve the problems they'll handle the supplier issues, the customer issues, they'll deal with the adopting new technology, the systems, processes, whatnot. So I'm so steeped in this now that I almost can't imagine why every company wouldn't want to be people first. Because a guy named Jack Stack said this to me, I thought it was very wise. He said, if you can walk into the back of a factory, he's a manufacturing guy, unescorted and just pass from the back to the front, you'll know everything you need to know. You can feel it in the people working there. And unescorted, very importantly, because, if you go on a formalized tour, they've prepped the whole thing. They tell people what stations they're going to stop at, what they want you to say. And I feel that, I'm sure you do too. You probably walk into restaurants, retail environments, manufacturing yourself, and you just feel it. You feel the joy. Northgate Markets, which is a Hispanic market chain down in Los Angeles, it's an Evergreen company. I've never felt the warmth. I mean, our companies are exceptional and conventional. They're in the 1% as far as the warmth felt between the founding family, the Gonzaleses, and their employee base. And that employee base will knock down brick walls for that family.
Yeah, I've been really curious. We've also had Pete Fader.
Am I getting there?
Yeah.
Any closer?
Yeah, no, that's great. No, that's great. Where I'm going is what it's linking to for me is this idea that I'm thinking about. We had Pete Fader on, customer lifetime value guru. And I'm going to do another session with him and Stephen Meyer, maybe you. And I want to look at, could you measure a company based off of employee lifetime value? Are they loyal? Do they stay? Do they add value through their creativity? Just as you do through a customer. And could you measure employee lifetime value?
I love it. And what I would say is that there's a couple things that come to mind. One is there's a professor at Stanford named Ed Lazier, and Ed spent a lot of time looking at labor practices and policies and the economics of it. And he said, I think it was back in the 70s, the deal basically was broken between employee and corporation. And it came from both sides. And prior to that, companies would invest tremendous amounts of time and resource in the development of their young people, moving through different training programs, all kinds of support, mentoring, sending to universities. Employees became less loyal, companies became less loyal, and it kind of broke the model, because if you made a heavy investment in an employee, the best thing your competitor would do is hire them as soon as the training's complete, because you get it for free with a slightly higher salary. Because if you're going to do all the training, it's hard to also do a substantial increase in salary on top of that. So there needs to be an element of loyalty on both sides. And so that deal's broken. In evergreen companies, that's not broken. They make that commitment. They spend that money. Yeah, the turn rates in these companies usually are much lower than industry rates. I ask this of every single person, what is industry? Where are you? And it is very common to hear people say, our longest tenured employee's been here 40 years, 50 years. That's incredible. They've spent their entire career. What is he doing now? Well, he started off and he was actually in the parts group. Now he actually runs one of our factories or a division. It's incredible.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying, because kind of one economic rationale is we're going to be such a great place to work that people will just want to work here for lower than their market salary. But that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is they're working there because you've invested in them.
You've invested in, and I polled the group on this, a biannual survey. People are at median or better as far as base salaries, and usually have upside compensation that gets total comp up into, it can be 60, 70, 80, 90th percentile. I mean, they are generous with their employees. And the reason is because their employees, frankly, are just more productive. They're more creative, they're more engaged. I mean, it really seems like, gosh, if you're lucky to get 4 hours of good work out of an employee, even if he's sitting at their desk for 12 hours. I mean, that is just crazy. And I see a very different thing, which is people are very respectful of the workday of their employees, and they want them to go home and experience their families and their friends in the evenings. But when they're there, they're working. They're committed. The other thing they do too, and this is probably not surprising, is most of these companies practice open book management. Pioneered, I think, the real great advocate of this has been Jack Stack, the gentleman I said earlier, wrote a book called The Great Game of Business. And they they show the income statement to the employees on a regular basis, weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever the process they want. They teach them what it means. The items on that income statement, they usually do a simplification of it just so they want people to feel intimidated by it. But in doing that, they're empowering the employees to see where the leverage is to help make a more profitable, cash generative business, because they know that money gets reinvested back in the business and it gets shared in profit sharing. Could you imagine venture capital-backed firms doing open book management with their employees when they're running towards a brick wall and they're going to run out of cash in 5 months? They would never do it. When I was running good, I wouldn't even consider it because I think it would have scared everybody. But that's the model, which is we're going to run this thing, we're going to get that next round of financing. If we don't get it, we're dead because we're burning so much cash. So we'll do everything in our power to raise that next round, making all kinds of commitments to try to get that done. In these environments, because the companies are so stable, and they have low levels of debt and they're profitable, you're bringing the entire team. And it's a very people first thing to do is we're bringing you into the mindset of an owner and of an entrepreneur. And you can decide at what level you want to participate. If you want to work 9 to 5 and give us a solid day's work, we love you for that. If you want to be more entrepreneurial, if you want to take leadership, put in the extra hours and we'll help train and develop you to do that. It's powerful stuff.
Yes. Yeah, it is. And it fits also with that long-term perspective of taking a long-term view on employees. So I think we've covered all of the 7, but there's one that I just want to double click on: pragmatic innovation, right? Innovation with purpose, focusing on practical incremental improvements that align with your mission. Talk to us about that, because, the goal of many entrepreneurs is to disrupt the industry. And many of the companies that you have studied and been with, they've disrupted the industry, but they've done it through pragmatic innovation. Why pragmatic innovation?
Yeah, it kind of, one, these companies do not have the benefit or desire to raise outside capital. So they have to do this from their own fuel. And you'd think this is a negative. I will argue this is a tremendous positive. And I think Ed Catmull, who wrote the book Creativity Inc., says this so well, and others do too, is constraints drive creativity. And so if you're thinking about how you want to solve a problem in a marketplace as an entrepreneur, and you say, oh, I can do the venture path, and if I'm lucky, I'll raise $100, $200 million, you can be sloppy about a lot of things. If that same entrepreneur says, I never want to raise outside capital, I want to serve that need in that marketplace. So what I have to do is I have to find a way to design a business model that's cash generative earlier. And I may even require me doing some things like consulting on the side to generate enough cash as I'm designing my product with a small team to get into a niche market, as we said earlier, that values that innovation so much, they're actually willing to pay a pretty good price for it. And then that starts generating cash for you, and you start building on that cash generative to start very carefully resourcing your team. And you'll see in this latter scenario, for example, in the venture context I used to live in, the goal was to hire a senior executive team very quickly under the founder. 5, 6, 7 people might do that in an 18-month period, because then they had to kind of build out the teams underneath them to actually deploy all that capital to secure market leadership. That was the game. In this model, the Evergreen model, you might hire one senior person besides yourself. And then a year later, a second. And you have to be very, very disciplined about, and this is back to trade-offs and focus and strategy. But the benefit of this is it's challenging the beginning, but it leads to levels of innovation and creativity in the business model, in the products, in the engagement of the customers. You don't have the convenience of sitting in isolation for 4 years building something and right talking to a customer.
Right.
You better talk to the customer. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then, there's, under pragmatic innovation, you have this idea of Kaizen that came out of the Japanese kind of model, which I think was really based on Deming, and that's continuous improvement at all levels of the organization, because anybody can help save $1. That dollar drops to the bottom line of an evergreen company. It can be shared as profits or redeployed or reinvested. You've got breakthrough innovations, invention that can be done in evergreen companies, as we discussed earlier, using kind of the Clayton Christensen model, which was the one that everybody did so successfully in Silicon Valley before all this money showed up, which is kind of we talked about before, small technical team, living on ramen, building a minimum viable product into a niche market where it more than satisfies those initial customers, matures that technology, its capabilities, then goes after mainstream markets very successfully and does it over a multi-decade period. So being an evergreen company does not mean you're not an innovative company. Some would argue, and a gentleman named Spencer Burke at Oldham Business School said this to me. He said, you got to think about this a little bit differently, Dave, given you came to Silicon Valley. Who truly are the most innovative companies? Is it the ones that have been around for 5 or 6 years that have raised a ton of venture capital and never made $1 of profit and will literally go out of business if they don't secure a round of financing? Or is it a company that's 150 years old that was founded in the Civil War that's doing $1 billion in revenue today and has continued to introduce new innovative products every 5 or 10 years, over and over and over again? Like the one you touched on earlier that's 300 years old. It's called Hollingsworth and Vos, and it's back in the Boston area. One of its early customers was Ben Franklin 300 years ago. He bought their paper products to use in his printing presses to actually do his newsletter. Today, one of their primary customers is Elon Musk. He sells their filtration technology membranes into SpaceX rockets and into Teslas. I mean, to be able to say that you were one of the greatest inventors of history with Ben Franklin, and then now with Elon, whatever current controversy is around him, he's an amazing human being, is an inventor. And what they've had to do is over 300 years, they've had to do hundreds of S-curves. If you think about product life cycles as S-curves, and a lot of those didn't work. And a lot of them did work. And as I talked about the stop-start battery earlier, that took 10, 11 years for them to get that really to kick in. And now that's one of their big S-curves. It's awesome. But that's
an innovative company as opposed to an innovative product.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue, I mean, crude here, but what has that founder done in Silicon Valley? He's raised a couple $100 million. He's raised a couple $100 million. He's a good salesman, or she's a good salesman. That's a sales role, is raising capital. Building a profitable business, that's an entrepreneur's. That's what a true entrepreneur does.
Excellent. So, I mean, we have talked about companies that have gotten there. Let's talk now a little bit about the entrepreneur that is wanting to build an evergreen company. And particularly in this podcast, what we're looking at, what are the few core strategic concepts that they can embrace that can help them get on the path? Because, Jack Stack is amazing, right? And there are so many people that are kind of writing books like him, but without his experience, that are kind of hawking like the latest concept. And we kind of, our goal is to kind of cut through some of the noise and get to the things that actually work. And so I was wondering if you could think about what are maybe 2 or 3 or 4 key strategic concepts that entrepreneurs should know about. And I'm going to give you 4 categories here these 4 categories are identifying the right opportunity, looking at the need in the market and things like that. Creating pricing power through competitive advantages, aligning operations and culture to achieve those advantages, and then reinvesting. You talk about reinvesting profits intelligently. Those are kind of like the 4 buckets that I'm particularly interested in. But just as thought starters, what would be 3 strategic concepts that you think an entrepreneur should bring to the beginning?
Yeah, this may feel very simple, but it's so fundamental. One is, and I'll call these more kind of philosophical. One is, if you have happy employees and you have happy end customers, the profits will follow and you can be in business forever. It might not be $100 million in revenue in 4 years or 10 years, but if you're willing to dedicate your life to having happy customers and happy employees, you can get there, and you will get there. Very importantly, then, if you are going to dedicate your life to this, it really has to be aligned with your natural calling. It has to be so deeply in yourself. You're willing to commit your life to this customer base and this employee group. And it's not transactional. You don't be able to be like Y Combinator and throw a bunch of stuff on the wall, at least in the early days of Y Combinator, see what sticks, gets traction. That's what your business is. There's no purpose in that. There's a natural orientation to that. This is really about saying, if I am going to dedicate my life to something, I would get joy out of serving these customers. And so that's a fundamental one. And as you can imagine, if we're going to try to keep you in control and allow you to own this for the rest of your life and could stay independent and private, you have to be extremely thoughtful of the design of your business model, your early engagement with customers, how you think about the pricing model, as you said a moment ago, and how those come together such that you start generating cash early, and be much more concerned in how much cash you're generating, not how much you're growing. And Clayton says this very succinctly with this, and I love it, is be impatient for profitability, but patient for growth, which is the reverse of Silicon Valley, which is be impatient for growth, patient for profitability. So again, if you're willing to dedicate your life to a deeper purpose, you want to serve a certain set of customers and employees, you have this orientation towards a well-designed business model that gets you early cash generation. You're patient for growth. I promise you in 30 years, you're going to be sitting on something really special.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, you said it before, and just now hearing you again, it hit me. Impatient for profit and patient for growth. That's the foundation of all of these great companies that you've studied that have lasted. Brilliant.
And interestingly, before venture capital arose as industry, this is how everybody did it. So any company that's older than, let's say, started in 1960, they had to do it this way.
They had
just
to
the way it was.
Live off the profits. Yeah,
exactly. But it's a really, I will say, while not easy, it's much easier to raise capital. You're going to find this surprising. It's much easier to go out and sell an idea and pitch it and be promotional and get money. You may not continue to get money. It may not work out, but for a brief moment in time, it can feel really good. This is hard work to build an evergreen company in the early days, but boy, the dividends of doing this successfully are through the roof. Can you imagine starting a company where in your lifetime is doing $1 billion in revenue. It's generating $100 million in profits. Let's say you own 90% of it. You've sold 10% of it to your employees because you want to bring them along, or 20% or something like that. And some major issue happens in your local community and they need a big check written to something happen, just really bad. And you just pull out your checkbook and write a $50 million check and you hand it to the mayor of the city and say, get that fixed. I mean, who can do that? Evergreen leaders do it all the time and they never talk about it. Public companies can't do it because you're not allowed to. Venture capital, you're not writing a $50 million check to anybody, or $10 million check, or $5 million, not even $1 million check. Private equity, no way. But you, as a leader and owner of an evergreen company, perhaps with your family, perhaps with your employees, you can do incredible things, and it's done frequently. I mean, stories I've heard about taking care of employees who've hit really tough times, I've never heard of these in a venture-backed context. Never heard of it. I can't say it's routine, but it can be done because, once again, you control this. If you want to say, something tragic happened to that family, and it may have nothing to do with your business, but it's involving one of your employees. I mean, I've seen things that it bring tears to your eyes, how deeply they care for these people.
I love it. I love it. And I love that you frame it and kind of, sure, there's tension between them, but you show that the combined system of these tensions deliver on purpose and deliver on profit and deliver on longevity, and they're not pure trade-offs.
So it acts as a system. But the important thing I think you're hitting on is, if you take very long planning horizons and you want to have success, you do have to bring others along with you. Your ecosystem needs to succeed too. So you naturally seek win-win relationships, not transactional win-lose relationships, because if you're getting out in 5 or 6 years or 7 years, you don't care, right? You can be almost abusive and lie to customers or mislead them or suppliers. But if you're going to be around for 50 years, you need incredibly well-aligned suppliers who are innovating themselves and partnering with you on new innovations. You need customers that are helping you see what you need to be doing to continue earning their business. This is built in win-win long-term relationships, and it's a very powerful compounding effect too.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of many entrepreneurs that we've gotten to interview, that they care as much about their suppliers and their employees.
And again, what I would distinguish is that you can care about them and you can say that, but can you actually deliver on that promise if you have to ultimately be sold or taken public? And I would argue you cannot. You cannot guarantee anything. As soon as you sell to a private equity firm, all bets are off. They can fire all your employees. They can raise all the prices. They can cut back every single supplier. And we just see this happen over and over again. And it just breaks the hearts of the entrepreneurs on the backside of this. So there's like, I wasn't expecting that. I mean, one guy said to me, he goes, he can't even go to the grocery store because so many employees were laid off in his local community that people hate him for selling the company to this private equity firm. This happens routinely.
Amazing. So many double, triple clicks to go into this, but we've reached and we have got our time together. In the meantime, you're doing a lot of stuff to help people access this. You've got your Evergreen journal, you've got your assessment tool, you've got your membership organization, you've got your articles. Just tell us a little bit about how someone who's listening here and wants to continue the journey and continue learning from you, what is their best path forward?
Yeah, and I'd like to clarify, all of the best practices, all of the wisdom that we're sharing actually comes from this community and thought leaders supporting this community. It's not from me. I'm not the expert. It's really leaning on the best ideas from 300 CEOs of all these wonderful companies across industries and sizes and generations. And so the way we unlock that is, we have a certain program for CEO members of the organization. We have about 300 of those. But what we've done this year, and I felt it was really important as part of the book, is get the book out another way, when Bo and I wrote together. And that tells a lot of the history and stories and best practices. We also have made the Evergreen Journal a subscription product where you can get the free version, which is fine, and you get a weekly newsletter. If you have the paid version, it's just, so I think it's right now, $99 a year. You can go and see all of our content, all of our videos, all of our articles, over 500 pieces of information about best practices of building these wonderful evergreen companies. And then we did something especially for kind of CEOs and owners of small businesses, mid-sized businesses. We call it the Evergreen Growth Navigator. This is all on my website, tugboatinstitute.com. You go and spend about an hour, put a bunch of information in about your company and yourself, and then we generate a report for you that says, here's how we think you're doing against each of the Evergreen 7 Ps on relative measure. For each of those Ps, here are roughly 7 to 8 of the best practices we see across the entire group of companies we work with. So think about those practices. And then based on what you gave us, we give you 5 specific customized opportunities we think would do the most to advance your company as an evergreen type company. And that's just uniquely to the information you provided us. And we charge, I think right now it's $1,500 for that. And I think it's worth way more than that. But the goal of Tugboat Institute is to basically try to change the way we think about business, to really empower evergreen founders and leaders and people who want to be evergreen-like to be able to be more successful. And hopefully, I feel this very personally, I hope it actually improves the lives of millions and millions of people because more companies become more people first and have greater longevity and are a greater service to their customers. And so, if people are interested in membership, if they're interested in Evergreen Journal Plus, called EJ Plus, or the Evergreen Growth Navigator, all those things, you can find us through our website, tugboatinstitute.com.
Great. And we'll put the links to that in the show notes as well. Dave, thank you so much for the work that you've done, and you're unique in your credibility or your experience, right? Going from HP to VC to now Evergreen, and seeing both sides and personally experiencing both sides and creating VC-backed companies and creating Evergreen companies. So thank you for doing that work. Thanks for packaging it in such a nice, memorable framework and for taking some time to unpack that with us here.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for taking the time with me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Strategy at Scale. Thank you to our producer, Oscar Perez, and our teams at Scaling Up, Outthinker, and Growth Institute. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm Kyan Krippendorf. We'll catch you soon with another episode of Strategy at Scale.